The objective today is to use a loop in a program to simplify the expression of repeated tasks. And don't freak out over this idea, this term called a loop. For me, the aha moment came when I was working on this lesson that a loop will always go inside of a function. So it's something that is smaller than a function. And just like its name, it's something that will loop around and occur several times inside of a function. So let's start with the softball question. And, I want you to type the code up on Canvas here. Which of the following is a loop? Is it this first one where it says for variable I equals 0, I is greater than 3, I plus plus? Or does the thing that looks like a loop sound like this? Function I am a loop. One great way to think of abstractions in programming would be if you can ask, how does this work? And the answer is not simple at all, then it's an abstraction. So here's my example. The command move forward and the command draw fish. Which of these is really hard to explain? Looking down at the code at the bottom, it says rectangle A is not an abstraction, even though it uses abstractions provided by the language like move to and random number. You must be able to create your own abstractions in programming. That does not mean a simple command of move to is an abstraction. So here's some more examples of student-created programs. Write which of the rectangles, the top or the bottom, is placed around an abstraction. What I'm going with here is that the bottom function or procedure is an example of an abstraction. This function manages the complexity of a program and was developed by the student. So the student wrote function draw square, that's what they're calling the function, and in order to do the function, these commands must execute. The top is not a student developed abstraction because it is around a control structure that is provided with the language. So in our case, we're using JavaScript most of the time. So that syntax and that form, the idea that the creators of the programming language created a keyword called move forward, technically that's an abstraction, but not a student-created abstraction. And that's the point of this lesson here. We want you, the programmer, to be able to create abstractions all on your own. So here's a challenge for you. A programmer wants to write a program in which the turtle draws 8 squares in a row. The final result should look something like this to the right. But something is wrong. The incorrect code is going to be shown on the next slide. The programmer has attempted to write a function to draw a single square, and then he wrote another function that attempts to call that function 8 times. Get it? Looping 8 times. So just like you're taught in school to do mental math, I want to teach you how to do some mental coding. So just looking at the code right here, mentally trace through it and determine which line of code should be removed to make the program do what it's supposed to. In real life, you may get a bunch of code and you have to just debug or figure out the problem all by yourself. Right here, I'm telling you to fix it, to make it work, all you have to do is remove a single line. So you tell me which line. 1, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, and so on. It's just only one line though. Now when you're ready for the answer, here is the next slide. It says the turn right on line 7 will reorient after drawing each square, which causes the turtle to not travel in the straight line, right? We want him to be in the straight line. So line 7 is the one really messing us up here. The main difference between when to use a function versus a loop depends on whether the code you're reusing needs to be used multiple times in a row or whether it needs to be used at some point later in your program. Let's take a moment here to nail down why you would use both. You'd use a function when the task needs to be repeated at different points in the program. You use a loop when the task that needs to be done is repeated in one place of your program, in the same place. So just so I know you're understanding the difference between the two, please tell me, when would you need a loop versus a function? Sometimes a function in our solution to a programming problem will need to be used multiple times in a row. In these instances, we should use a loop to repeatedly call that function. Keeping functions at the center of our thinking helps. So let's say you're asked to write a program that draws a tree. Your first 3 thoughts should be, what types of functions, will there be loops, and will I use random numbers? It's appropriate for the student to say that no function will actually have randomness built in, but rather the randomness will come when the function is called, passing a random number as a value of a parameter. So in English, what I'm saying is draw scene is the function, and the types of things in that function will be to paint the background a certain color, to call another function called draw tree. And then that function, draw tree, will have random values for the size and the number of branches in the tree. So let's just break that apart here. What are the two functions I mentioned, and what are the random numbers being used for? I'll give you a hint. There's two specific things that the random numbers are being used for. So here's two more functions for you. The draw tree function with the parameters of size and number of branches. This will draw a tree of a given size and a given number of branches. We'll use a loop to call a draw branch function, which looks like this right here. The draw branch function has parameters of size and angle. Now, draw a branch of a tree of the given size at any given angle is a better way to probably say that. A branch is composed of a bunch of lines that draw crosses, and here we'll loop a random number of times to draw some number of crosses, and this is nice for the computer to do the randomness versus you specifying all the time, because if we're looking at a forest of trees, we know that every tree is not the exact same size. And you could, for every single tree you want to create, specify what numbers you want to use, or you can do something maybe a little more reasonable, put some parameters around it, and try to make it look more random, and thus make it look more natural. So here I'm asking for what's the name of the functions, and then tell me which function is using a loop and the random numbers you need. So there's a lot to think about in that lesson. With any free time you have in class, I'd like you to go ahead and go to this link so you could get started on your digital design project, all right? But for now, the DOL will read something like this. Describe, using a top-down approach, how you would create a program to draw a white snowflake on a blue background. And make sure you use random numbers, and make sure that the snowflake will be unique every time you run the code. Now, you don't need to write the exact code or blocks that you would use. I'd like it, but you should be describing what functions you would need to create, where you would need to create them, where you would be using loops, and where you would use random numbers. So that's a short lesson, but with a lot to think about. Now you should understand what a loop is and how loops work and where they work within a program.